The first thing I noticed was the absolute silence on the radio. Channel 9, the main dispatch frequency, is never quiet. Not at 6 o'clock on a Monday morning. Not when you have 412 trucks rolling across 26 states carrying everything from chicken tenders to pharmaceutical-grade insulin. That will seek spoil. If the trailer temperature drops below 32 degrees for more than 45 minutes. My name is Walter Vance. I am 53 years old, and for the last 11 years, I have been the Senior Logistics Systems Manager at Vanguard Freight Solutions out of Memphis, Tennessee. That is a fancy title for the guy who makes sure our massive fleet knows where they are going, what they are carrying, and how to get there without killing the cargo, the driver, or the company's profit margins. When dispatch goes silent, it means one of two things. Either everything is running so perfectly that nobody needs assistance, which has occurred exactly 0 times in my career, or the system is down and nobody can reach anyone. I had a very bad feeling it was the second one. Let me explain something about freight logistics that most people do not understand. When you order something online and it shows up at your door 2 days later, you think it is magic. It is not magic. It is 1,000 moving pieces held together by software, diesel fuel, and guys like me who have not slept a full night since the first term of the president back in 2008. The routing system I built at Vanguard is not some off-the-shelf program you buy from a vendor and plug in. It is a living, breathing organism that I have been feeding and patching and rewiring for over a decade. Every truck has a global positioning system transponder that communicates with our dispatch server every 90 seconds. The system calculates optimal routes based on delivery windows, traffic patterns, weather conditions, fuel prices at every truck stop along the way, and hours of service regulations that the Department of Transportation enforces. Miss a delivery window for a major supermarket chain by 30 minutes, and that is a $15,000 penalty. Let a driver exceed his 14-hour duty clock, and that is a $16,000 fine per violation, and a mark on our safety record that follows us for 3 years. Keep a trailer of frozen shrimp sitting on a loading dock in August because the routing algorithm sent the replacement truck to the wrong warehouse, and that is $180,000 in spoiled product, and a client we will never see again. My system handles all of that. It runs on a combination of custom database queries, proprietary application programming interfaces that connect to our clients' warehouse management systems, and about 60,000 lines of code that I have written, rewritten, and patched together. It works every single day, 365 days a year, because freight does not take holidays, and neither do I. The trouble started 3 months ago when Vanguard got acquired by Apex Capital, a private equity firm out of New York that buys logistics companies compulsively. Apex Capital sent in their operations director, Julian Thorne, to optimize our business. Julian is 31 years old, wears those slim fit suits with no socks and loafers, and says things like leverage synergies and drive operational alpha without any apparent awareness that those phrases mean nothing. He has a Master of Business Administration degree from Wharton, which he mentions within the first 4 minutes of every conversation. And he has never been inside a truck cab, never loaded a 48-foot trailer in 100-degree heat, and never had to explain to a driver named Big Dan why his route just changed for the 3rd time because a bridge in Arkansas is flooded. Julian called me into his office on a Wednesday. He had redecorated the space that used to belong to our old vice president of operations, a woman named Brenda Henderson, who actually understood trucking and got pushed into early retirement the day Apex Capital took over. Now the office had a standing desk, a monitor the size of a movie screen, and a fake plant. "Walter," he said, barely looking up from his laptop. "Big change is coming. We are bringing in a new fleet management platform, Logi Smart AI. It is artificial intelligence powered, cloud native, and it is going to transform how we do logistics." I sat down on a chair I dragged from the hallway. "What is Logi Smart AI?" Julian turned his laptop around to show me a website with blue gradient backgrounds and stock photos of European trucks. "It is a startup out of Texas. My buddy Bradley Cole runs it. They have built a routing engine that can replace your entire legacy system. Real-time optimization, predictive analytics, autonomous dispatch, the whole package. His buddy Bradley. That was the first red flag. The second was that I had never heard of Logi Smart AI, and I know every major logistics platform on the market because it is literally my job. How many trucks is their biggest deployment? I asked. Julian scrolled through the website. It says here they have handled fleets of up to 50 vehicles. 50. We run 412. That is like testing a canoe on a pond and then taking it into the Atlantic during hurricane season. It scales, Julian said with the confidence of a man who has never had to make anything scale. Bradley assured me. The artificial intelligence learns as it goes. Julian, I said, keeping my voice steady, our routing system handles Department of Transportation compliance for every state we operate in. Hours of service rules, electronic logging device mandate integration, and hazardous materials routing restrictions. We carry Class 3 flammables and Class 8 corrosives that legally cannot travel through certain tunnels, across certain bridges, or within 2 miles of certain water treatment facilities. Does Logi Smart AI handle hazardous materials routing compliance? Julian stared at me for a second. It handles routing. I am sure hazardous materials are part of that. Those 9 words told me everything I needed to know. This man was about to bet the entire company on a system built by his business school buddy's startup that had never handled a fleet our size, probably had no hazardous materials compliance module, and was going to learn as it goes. But here is the thing. Julian did not want my opinion. He wanted my departure. 3 days later, Human Resources sent me a calendar invite for a meeting titled Organizational Realignment Discussion. I knew what that meant. I had been in this industry long enough to speak fluent corporate euphemism. The meeting was short. Julian, the Human Resources Director Denise Worthington, and a 26-year-old kid named Logan Brooks, whom Julian introduced as our new Director of Logistics Technology. Logan had graduated from some coding boot camp 8 months ago, worked at Bradley's startup for 6 months, and was now apparently qualified to replace a guy who had been doing this for 11 years. Logan is going to be managing the migration to Logi Smart AI, Julian said. We will need you to hand over all system access and documentation by Friday. Today was Tuesday. They wanted me to hand over a decade of institutional knowledge in 3 days. Under the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, 29 United States Code, Section 2101, a company is required to provide 60 days of advance written notice for mass layoffs. While my individual position did not constitute a mass layoff on its own, Julian was systematically pushing out all the senior operational staff who actually built Vanguard, including Brenda Henderson, our former vice president. I pointed this out to Denise Worthington, noting that purging the veteran guard without proper notice or due process created severe legal exposure for Apex Capital. Denise shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but Julian brushed it off with a wave of his hand, claiming they were just aligning resources for the technology transition. You realize, I said, that our biggest client, Pinnacle Grocers, has a 138-truck dedicated fleet contract with us. Their delivery windows are measured in 15-minute increments. If we miss a window at one of their distribution centers, they do not just fine us, they have the contractual right to terminate the agreement and sue for damages. My system has hit 99.2% on-time delivery for Pinnacle Grocers for 7 straight years. Logi Smart's artificial intelligence will handle it, Logan said, not looking up from his phone. It has machine learning models trained on millions of data points. What was the source of those millions of data points? I asked. Logan glanced at Julian like he was not sure he was allowed to answer. Simulated environments, mostly, but the models are extremely robust, simulated environments. He trained his machine learning models on fake data and was about to unleash it on real trucks carrying real cargo worth real money. This was going to be spectacular, and not in a good way. I spent Wednesday and Thursday doing what they asked, documenting everything I could. But here is the reality of complex systems that have evolved over 11 years. You cannot write down instinct. You cannot document the fact that Pinnacle Grocers' warehouse in Charlotte has a loading dock supervisor named Otis who always marks trucks as late if they arrive during his lunch break, even if they are on time. So you have to route Charlotte deliveries to arrive before 11:30 or after 1:15. You cannot explain in a manual that our driver, Dwight Miller, has a medical exemption that limits his driving hours to 10 instead of 11, but the exemption expired and got renewed with different terms last March, and the electronic logging system still shows the old limit. So you have to manually override it every Monday morning, or he gets flagged for a violation he is not committing. Logan shadowed me for those 2 days. He asked questions that revealed he did not understand the basics. "What is a bill of lading?" he asked at one point. I am not joking. The kid was supposed to run logistics for a $340 million freight company, and he did not know what a bill of lading was. That is like hiring a chef who asks what an oven is. Friday came. I packed my coffee mug, the photo of my daughter's wedding, and the stress ball shaped like a truck that my team had given me as a joke 5 years ago. I shook hands with the dispatchers, the dock supervisors, and the drivers who happened to be in the yard. Big Dan grabbed me in a bear hug that nearly cracked my ribs. "You sure about this, Walter? They are going to run this place into the ground without you." "Not my circus anymore, Dan. Take care of yourself." I drove home on Interstate 40, listening to classic rock and trying to figure out if what I was feeling was anger, relief, or the particular numbness that comes from watching someone make a catastrophic mistake and being powerless to stop it. Probably all three. The first call came Saturday morning. My buddy Neil in dispatch texted me. "Logi's Smart AI went live at midnight. The system just routed a truck carrying frozen insulin through the Eisenhower Tunnel in Colorado. That is a hazardous materials Class 9 restricted route. The driver caught the error and refused to enter. Logan told him to just go around. The Eisenhower Tunnel sits at 11,158 feet in the Rocky Mountains. Going around means adding 6 hours in a mountain pass that is closed half the year. The insulin had a 4-hour delivery window. By the time the driver completed the detour, the insulin had exceeded its temperature limit, ruining $50,000 worth of life-saving medication and violating state transportation regulations. The driver was furious because the delay forced him to exceed his driving limit, resulting in a direct compliance infraction that he had no way of resolving. By Monday morning, my phone looked like a newsreel of a slow-motion apocalypse. The artificial intelligence routing system had been live for 60 hours, and it had already created what I can only describe as logistical anarchy. First, it routed 14 trucks carrying Pinnacle Grocer's frozen chicken to their Nashville distribution center. Pinnacle's Nashville distribution center handles dry goods. Their frozen facility is in Murfreesboro, 30 miles south. 14 truckloads of chicken sat on a loading dock with no refrigerated bay for 3 hours. By the time someone figured it out, the internal temperature of the trailers had risen past the food safety threshold. $2,100,000 in product was completely destroyed. This was a clear violation of the Food Safety Modernization Act's sanitary transportation rules, making Vanguard fully liable for the loss. Under 21 Code of Federal Regulations Part 1, the carrier is strictly responsible for maintaining temperature logs, and since Logi Smart AI had failed to connect to the reefer telematics, we had zero records to prove compliance. The Nashville warehouse supervisor was screaming at Neil over the phone, demanding to know why Vanguard was trying to dump warm, ruined poultry onto their dry loading docks. Then the artificial intelligence decided to optimize the fleet by reassigning drivers mid-route. Drivers who were headed to Phoenix got redirected to Portland. Drivers scheduled for local runs in Memphis got sent to Florida. The system did not account for hours of service regulations. It was telling guys who had already been driving for 10 hours to take on 12-hour runs. When the drivers refused because of federal safety laws, the system flagged them as non-compliant and locked them out of the dispatch portal. Neil told me the dispatch office was in a state of sheer panic. Drivers were calling in screaming because their electronic logging devices were flashing red violations, and they refused to move their rigs. By Tuesday, we had 167 trucks sitting idle because their drivers were locked out of the system, and Logan could not figure out how to override it. He called Bradley in Texas. Bradley said it was a known issue, and they were working on a patch. A known issue in a software system that was managing a $340 million freight operation. That is like finding out the brakes on your car are a known issue after you have already started down a steep mountain pass. Dock supervisors at 5 different terminals were reporting gridlock because outbound trucks could not get their electronic manifests. The Pinnacle Grocers disaster got worse. Their vice president of supply chain, a terrifying woman named Victoria Finch, called Julian directly. I know this because Neil forwarded me the internal email Julian sent afterward, which was essentially 4 paragraphs of panic disguised as corporate communication. Pinnacle Grocers was threatening to invoke the termination clause in our contract, a $47 million dedicated fleet agreement that represented roughly 14% of Vanguard's annual revenue. Wednesday brought the Department of Transportation into the picture. Turns out LogiSmart's artificial intelligence-driven compliance module had been generating fraudulent electronic logging device records. Not intentionally, the system just did not understand how logging data worked, so it was backfilling gaps with fabricated hours. When the Department of Transportation pulled our records for a random audit on 3 trucks in New Mexico, they found driving logs that showed the same driver in 2 different states at the same time. That is not a glitch. That is federal fraud under Section 390.35 of the federal regulations. And it carries civil penalties of up to $16,000 per violation per day. The Department of Transportation opened a formal investigation. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration flagged our carrier rating for immediate review. Insurance companies started calling, asking questions about our system migration and whether it affected our risk profile. When your insurance company starts asking questions, it means they are looking for a reason to raise your premiums or drop you entirely. Thursday morning, I was sitting on my back porch drinking coffee and watching the squirrels fight over the bird feeder when my phone rang. It was Julian Thorne, and he sounded like a man who just realized the building he was standing in was on fire. Walter, his voice was hoarse. "I need you to come in, morning, Julian," I replied. "I saw on the industry news boards that Pinnacle Grocers pulled their dedicated fleet contract. That has got to sting. Listen, I know we had some disagreements during this transition. There were unforeseen technical integration hurdles." "Julian, take a breath," I said. He took a breath, but it did not seem to help. "The Department of Transportation is threatening to suspend our interstate operating authority. Pinnacle Grocers is gone. Cisco is threatening to leave by the weekend. We have 108 drivers who have not been paid because the new system cannot process payroll exports correctly. The fuel card integration is completely down, so drivers are paying for diesel out of pocket. I have a driver in Oklahoma who has been sitting at a truck stop for 36 hours because the system will not generate his dispatch order, and Logan cannot figure out why." "Sounds like quite a week," I said. "Will you come back?" "On a consulting basis. Whatever you want, we will pay it," Julian pleaded. I had been thinking about this moment since Friday. Part of me wanted to say no. Part of me wanted to let Apex Capital burn their investment to the ground. But then I thought about the drivers. Big Dan with his daughter's college tuition coming due. Dwight Miller, who sends money to his mother in a nursing home every single week. 412 drivers who did not create this mess but were paying for it. $85,000, I said. Retainer, non-refundable, wired to my bank account before I walked through the door. Plus a new 2-year contract at double my previous salary with a legal clause that states no system changes can be made without my written approval. Julian tried to push back. "Walter, please, be reasonable," he whined. "We are talking about a major corporate structure. I cannot just fire Logan on a whim, and double your salary is outside our standard compensation bands. I will have to get approval from the compensation committee, and that could take weeks." I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Julian, you think you have weeks? The Department of Transportation is not going to wait weeks. Pinnacle Grocers did not wait weeks. If you do not wire that money and sign that contract today, by next week you will not have standard compensation bands because you will not have a company. The board of directors will sue Apex Capital for waste of corporate assets and breach of the duty of care for allowing an unqualified manager to bypass standard procurement safeguards. You chose to bring in your friend's unproven software without a pilot program or comparative analysis. That is personal liability, Julian. There was a heavy silence on the line. I could hear his shallow, ragged breathing, the sound of a corporate climber drowning in his own hubris. How do I know you can even fix this? He whispered, his voice cracking under the strain. Looking at the ruins of your plan, I knew I had him. Because I built it, Julian. I built the foundation, I wrote the database schema, and I know every single driver by name. You tried to replace human experience with an algorithm that cannot tell a dry dock from a freezer. Now, either wire the retainer or start drafting your bankruptcy petition. Done, Julian said immediately, his voice completely defeated. I am not finished, I continued. Logan Brooks goes today. I do not care where you send him. Send him back to Bradley's startup. Send him to business school. Send him to the moon. I do not work with people who do not know what a bill of lading is, and I want a written letter from Apex Capital's managing partner, Alistair Stone, acknowledging that this disaster was caused by their decision to replace a functioning system with an untested platform without proper due diligence. By deploying an unverified routing engine that lacked essential compliance features, Julian had engaged in a clear breach of fiduciary duty under Delaware corporate law, exposing the parent firm to massive shareholder and regulatory liabilities. This written admission would protect me legally and establish that the operational failures were entirely the result of executive mismanagement rather than my restoration process. I also demanded a comprehensive audit of our insurance carrier communications to ensure that the blame for the carrier rating downgrade fell squarely on Apex Capital's tech department. Our primary liability underwriter, Amalgamated Underwriters, had already threatened to cancel our $50 million commercial umbrella policy within 48 hours, which would ground the entire fleet legally. Alistair Stone already knows you bypassed our standard procurement procedures to hire your business school friend. If you do not sign this, I will call Stone directly and explain how your lack of diligence voided our operating insurance. Julian agreed to everything in under 30 seconds. The wire cleared my account 20 minutes later. I showed up Friday morning at 6 o'clock. The parking lot was half empty because a third of our drivers had gone home or were still stranded at truck stops across the country. Neil met me at the door with a hot cup of coffee and a look of pure relief. I have never been so happy to see anyone in my life, he said. The dispatch floor looked like a war zone. Phones were ringing nonstop, whiteboards were covered in scribbled routes, and Logan's abandoned desk had 3 monitors all showing the LogiSmart AI dashboard, which was displaying a cheerful message that said optimizing your fleet above a spinning loading icon that had apparently been spinning for 19 hours straight. First thing I did was kill LogiSmart AI. I unplugged the entire connection. Metaphorically and literally, I disconnected the application programming interface, revoked the access tokens, and shut down the cloud integration. Logan had never bothered to disconnect my legacy system because he did not know where the server lived or how to access the database. It was still there on those local servers, untouched, like a faithful dog waiting for its owner to come home. I brought my system back online in 40 minutes. The routing engine spun up, recognized that 412 trucks were scattered across the country in positions that made no logical sense, and started calculating recovery routes. I spent the next 14 hours at my desk manually reassigning every truck, checking every driver's hours of service status against reality instead of the fabricated logs LogiSmart had created, and rebuilding the transport schedules. I needed to prove our system was functional before other major clients like Cisco pulled the plug. By Saturday afternoon, every driver had a valid dispatch order. Fuel cards were reactivated. Payroll exports were corrected and sent to accounting for emergency processing. I personally called the Department of Transportation investigator Sandra Cobb, and walked her through exactly what had happened. I showed her the fabricated electronic logging records, demonstrated that they were generated by a third-party application that had since been completely disconnected, and provided clean logs from my original system proving our actual compliance history. I walked her through the SQL database logs, showing her the exact timestamps of when LogiSmart AI started backfilling ELD data and comparing it to the physical transponder logs that were stored in the secure black box on the trucks. This proved beyond a doubt that Vanguard's drivers did not intentionally falsify their hours, but rather that the AI system had generated fraudulent records autonomously. She was not happy, but she was fair. The investigation would continue, but she recommended against an immediate shutdown order. ESCO stayed. The Department of Transportation downgraded their investigation from an imminent hazard to a standard compliance review. The 108 drivers got their back pay by the following Wednesday, along with a bonus for the inconvenience. The Pinnacle Grocers contract was gone, and that hurt. $47 million a year is a heavy blow, and Victoria Finch was not the forgiving type, but the company survived. Brenda Henderson actually called me from her retirement home in Florida to congratulate me, laughing over the phone about how the New York suits had to eat humble pie. 3 weeks later, Julian Thorne was reassigned to another Apex Capital portfolio company. Rumor has it he is optimizing a chain of car washes in New Jersey. Logan Brooks went back to Texas. I heard Bradley's startup lost 2 other clients after our disaster made the rounds in the industry. Turns out when a logistics platform causes a federal investigation, word travels fast. Faster than LogiSmart could route a truck, that is for sure. I got my corner office, nothing fancy, same building, same floor, but it has a window that overlooks the truck yard. Every morning, I can watch the rigs roll out, lights on, diesel rumbling, headed in the right direction because the system that tells them where to go was built by someone who understands that behind every data point is a real person with a family, a mortgage, and a kid who needs braces. Neil stopped by my office last Friday with a gift. It was a stress ball shaped like a truck, just like my old one, but this one had writing on it. It said, "Route Master, do not replace." I put it on my desk next to the coffee mug and leaned back in my chair. Through the window, I could see Big Dan's rig pulling out of the yard, right on schedule, headed for Charlotte. He would make Otis's loading dock well before lunch, because the system knew to get him there by 11:15. Some things you cannot teach an algorithm. Some things you can only learn by being there, day after day, solving problems that do not exist in simulated environments, building workarounds for a world that does not run on clean data and perfect conditions. You can throw all the artificial intelligence and machine learning and cloud-native buzzwords you want at a problem. But at the end of the day, somebody has to know that Otis takes his lunch at 11:30 and Dwight's exemption changed last March, and the Eisenhower Tunnel is closed to hazardous materials. Somebody has to care enough to remember. I poured some coffee and raised the mug toward the window where the trucks were rolling. Here is to the guys who keep it moving, and here is to the people smart enough not to fix what is not broken. That is what makes getting up early worthwhile.